Okay, welcome to episode 114 of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Wyndham Wallace. Wyndham is a Berlin-based writer whose critically acclaimed first book, Lee, Myself and I, about his friendship with Lee Hazlewood, the man behind These Boots Are Made for Walking, was published in 2015. In 2024, he helped lead a number of victims of child sexual abuse over 3 decades to a public settlement with Horris Hill Prep School, and he continues to campaign for justice for all those abused in private education, past and present. Welcome, Wyndham.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, pleasure. So, how I'd love for us to begin today is for you to share a bit of your journey. How did you get into doing this work, campaigning, you know, and where you are today?
Um, I certainly has never set out to be doing this. Um, in the late 2010s, I suppose the story really begins there. I started to recognize that although I'd moved to Berlin, where I live now, in 2004, I was being really enraged by the behavior of British uh, um, politicians, essentially, establishment politicians, especially on the right. Um, and for a long time, I put this down to the bullying that I had experienced at my public school, Radley, and just saw these men as ciphers for the same kind of entitled, thoughtless, and careless behavior that I had sometimes been on the end of. But when the pandemic arrived, I shifted from wanting to write a book about it, about that particular period, something that wouldn't have been entirely dissimilar to Richard Beard's Sad Little Men, who coincidentally was at Radley a few years before me. But I started to realize that my response to to what was going on in politics was even with the likes of Boris Johnson, it was still disproportionate. And I even found myself watching Dominic Cummings's press conference from the Rose Garden about him escaping for an eye test in Barnard Castle. I threw up afterwards. Um, and I realized, like, this is something deeper going on here. There is something troubling me about these men to an absolutely, almost comic degree, and it wasn't funny at all. And at this point, I started to explore the idea that what was making me upset wasn't the sort of entitlement that they had so much as the fact that they were lying. It was very clear that they were lying. We could all see that they were lying about what was taking place in the early years of the early months of the pandemic, as we had seen also with Brexit. I mean, they'd even stuck a lie on a bus and then stood by it, making words entirely meaningless. And eventually, I reached the point where I discovered that I didn't discover, I'd always known, but I just hadn't acknowledged it to myself that I had also been lied to as a child because I had been molested by two separate teachers over the 5 years I was at Horris Hill, and that reality had been perfectly visible to everybody. Large amounts of the lesser abuse were taking place in public places, in classrooms, in front of classes, sometimes at such a volume that other teachers would come in and check that the teachers were there. Sometimes they were happening behind scenes, but essentially, my reality was denied. I was told nothing had happened to me and that I was exaggerating. I did tell a few people in positions of power, and it was just brushed aside, like, no, no, And so yeah, I started to realize that I needed to, come to terms with what had happened to me, and that perhaps maybe then Boris Johnson might not make me quite so angry. I needed to separate my past from my present, and I think the pandemic had also brought that into perspective because it was, like being back at school in a way. My girlfriend at the
Mhm.
time lived in England, so I was separated from my loved ones, my family. I was, being governed by unfamiliar laws, even here in Berlin, where they were at least handled, I think, rather more satisfactorily. And I didn't really understand the laws. And I didn't really understand the people who were making these laws. Like, I didn't really see why they should be making these declarations that were quite obviously nonsensical and largely there for their own convenience and their own, crucially, to put their reputations but ahead of the safety of the people in whom they were meant to be, over whom they were meant to be holding some kind of power, but for the betterment of that people. So the whole thing started from there. And took me a long time to really come to terms with that until one night I was telling a story to an American friend and his American friend as well. And it was a story about what had happened to me the first time I was assaulted. And the next day, my American friend called me up and said, "Look, mate, I was talking about this last night after you left, and I kind of been encouraged to tell you this. And I thought I should have told this a few years ago because I've heard that story before. Mate, it's not funny. It's not funny at all. It's tragic. It's about child abuse. Like that's about you being abused. And I don't know. I just feel like I have to say something." So then I started trying to figure out if there's anybody I could speak to about it. Other people who might be able to say, yeah, yeah, I agree. That happened to me. It was abuse. I remember that. And the first person I spoke to was my cousin, from whom I'd been largely estranged since I'd left school because he'd gone off the rails. And I was encouraged not to have any contact with him. But when I did contact him, it became pretty damn clear, pretty damn fast, why he'd gone off the rails. And he too had been abused. And from that point onwards, I started looking for more people from the school with whom I'd never spoken since I'd left its gates. I'd only returned to the school once for 2 hours. And yeah, the next thing I knew, I was talking to a lawyer. That lawyer told me, if you want to get an apology, which was the only thing I wanted, an acknowledgement, just wanted to be heard. I wanted them to say, "We know that this happened and we're sorry. And it happened to many of you." At that point, the lawyer explained that the only way to make public schools accept any kind of responsibility is to threaten them financially. And so taking legal action seemed like the only option I had if I was to try and make this real and real for other people, whether they be victims or whether it be the people around me to whom I've always felt like I had to explain myself. And it's very hard to explain yourself when you don't really understand something yourself either, even at, the age of 50. So I wanted something that I could just basically say, look, this is what happened. It's true. They've acknowledged it. Now I can move on with my life. And that involved finding more victims, encouraging them to take cases if they too felt they needed the same acknowledgement. And yeah, during the course of that whole 3 years or so, I've obviously learned a great deal more about the culture of private boarding school education in particular, and how it operates, how the closing of ranks is considered to be a sort of an honorable act rather than one that prevents long-term injury of one kind or another to children. So I don't feel at this point, whilst my own case is over, I don't feel like I can just sit back because there's so many other people like me. And what happened to me, whilst it was abuse, I have to acknowledge for the sake of other people who also experienced abuse, what happened to me was slight in comparison. It was awful, it was wrong, it was illegal, but it was slight. And that makes it easier for me to talk than it is for others who were maybe beaten every single day for 5 years. And I know such people exist from Horris Hill.
Thank you. Bless you for your courage in speaking up and engaging others and getting an apology from the school, a financial apology. I know it's not easy, and I know a few who've tried to go down the legal route, and it's devastated them on one level. Because almost what I feel is the legal system's it closes ranks. I mean, if you look at the Sutton report, it shows 70 to 75% of lawyers, high court judges, I think, have been to private schools, many of which are boarding schools.
Yes, there's a self-perpetuating system here. that will continue until we acknowledge the harm that it has done. And it is it is an old cliche, but, trauma is passed from generation to generation. And I just think that we need to acknowledge now that those who, like myself, perhaps have ended up, I'm 53, I live alone, I have lived alone for 20 years. I've had relationships, but I've largely self-destructed them. I don't make huge amounts of money from my writing, but at least I am happy. We need to acknowledge that people like myself aren't the only people who are harmed by this system, because if you look at Boris Johnson, essentially, it's Rishi Sunak the same, even more so in a way. I just see two broken, forlorn children
Mm.
desperately trying to puff themselves up like peacocks to prove to everybody that they're not hurt in any way whatsoever. And in so doing, meting out the same treatment that they experienced and passing on their trauma, a thoughtlessness, a carelessness, and a lack of empathy that one is forced to forego in boarding school, whether towards oneself or towards others. We just respond differently, but we've all been broken like horses.
Yeah, 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 definitely. So that survival, strategic survival personality that Nick says, not everyone is traumatized by boarding school, but everyone has to survive. It's how did we survive? And when I interviewed Nick for the film a couple of years ago, he says Boris is the king of the boarding school survivors.
Yeah, in many ways he is. I think it's easy to forget that, somebody can go to war and not be injured, not be harmed, and still come back traumatized because of what they've seen. So I don't think it's
Mm,
important whether or not Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak were themselves abused. I suspect not. I think they were probably more likely to have been meting out a certain amount of abuse, which is not I don't mean that in a, scurrilous manner, but, even I bullied it briefly. I remember bullying a child once and suddenly realizing what I'd done and backing the hell out as fast as possible. But yeah, I think they are very much examples of what happens if you subscribe to this system fully. You become in complete
mm.
denial of who you actually are. It's all an act. Nothing about Johnson is real, apart from, well, not even his hair.
Well, maybe it'd be interesting. I was reading this. I was interviewed a few days ago, and in this book, Just Boris, and I have a few about Boris, but most of them don't actually really talk about his experiences. And in here, it just it's like, oh my God. Um, I usually prepare this. You can see I didn't prepare this as well. Here's one I did earlier. It was basically saying, no, where is it? Yeah. So in any case, this is he starts at his new boarding school, which is forgotten the name of it when he was 11.
Ashdown House, was it?
Ashdown House, that's it. In any case, family observers detected a startling change in him not long after he began attending Ashdown House. One noticed, I heard he had hard times at school for his Turkish lineage, coming under fire for being a foreigner and coming over the channel from Brussels. So he created a disheveled look and persona. This 1930s style English eccentric who appears to be bumbling but is actually fantastically well read. It was a survival tactic and it worked brilliantly. So why is Boris like he is? 11 years old. That was the
Yeah,
way he
yeah.
survived.
I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg is another great example of that. I mean, it's like his greatest ambition has always been to dress like a headmaster.
Yeah, 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 yeah. He was eaten. I don't know what he was. Um,
I'm not
I don't
sure.
know if he was at his prep school. So, I mean, you talk a little bit about Horris Hill. Um, I mean, then there's that aspect of culture. You know, I'd love you to go into a little bit more depth. What did you learn about the culture of private boarding schools? You've mentioned closing ranks, but what else?
Well, I mean, I can dive right in at the deep end if
Please
you like here.
go
Um,
for it.
the the manner in which I've started to think now about private education, particularly boarding school education. And I should just, by the way, emphasize that not I'm not educated about the boarding system beyond the kind of red brick establishments that are favored by the aristocracy and the military and such like. I'm not talking about, you know, I don't have any experience of other schools. So this is very much about the establishment, the elite, the sort of top rank that supposedly I was sent to. Um, I think of these schools as branches of a cult. Um, they are largely run by charismatic, powerful people whose beliefs we have to subscribe to. They can persuade people to do almost anything on their behalf. They exploit traditions as though they're rituals, and they will go to all lengths to protect their system. And consequently, bad things happen in cults repeatedly because they are secluded and away from, mainstream society, much as my schools were always up long drives, and out of sight from the general public. I think if you start to see them as cults, it makes it a lot easier. I don't mean necessarily literally cults, but I do mean not far short of. If you start to think of them like that, then you start to see also the other victims involved in this. It's very easy, I think, as somebody who was abused as a child, to focus very much on yourself and the effect it had upon yourself because it wasn't acknowledged, and you become obsessed with trying to make it acknowledged, to try and be heard, which I think is probably the greatest wound of all, is this sense that you haven't been heard. And that's one of the hardest things for me to have put behind me. I still don't think I successfully have. But if you think of it as a cult, then you can look even at your parents as victims of a cult. Like, my parents had been through the boarding school system. My aunts and uncles had all been through the boarding school system. Many of them had been to Eton. It was completely normalized for them to go through the boarding school system. And because they still subscribed to it, they could excuse any of the boarding school system's shortcomings by saying, well, look where I am. It doesn't seem to have hurt me. I guess it was therefore good for me. I'm going to do the same for my children. But I recall a conversation with my mother in the first year or so of the pandemic, after I'd first tried writing about my very first day at Horris Hill, where I hadn't even been allowed to say goodbye to my mother, and to which my father hadn't even come. He may have been babysitting my mother, my sister. He could have been playing golf for all I know. He'd rather not make a fuss. But my mother told me that, as I sort of said, what did you do when you found out that you weren't going to say goodbye to me after I'd been taken off for a trip at the school? What did you do? And much to my astonishment, she said, first of all, well, we just finished our tea, and then we gathered our stuff and left. And I was just like, I was aflame. It's like, really? That's all you've got to say about it? And then my poor mother said, well, I mean, that wasn't just all of it. I mean, I then got in the car and I didn't even make it halfway down the drive. I was crying so much I couldn't drive anymore. I couldn't see where I was going. And that was this like absolutely revelationary moment where I understood how much pain she too had been through at this separation, one to which she had willingly, agreed. I don't think this was anything to do with my father putting pressure on her or anything like that. She had willingly agreed to it too. But then she'd seen it from the other perspective, and clearly it had upset her very, very badly. And that was when this idea of it being a cult started to sort of crystallize. And that way I also started to connect it with the people who have come out of the school and have been running the country. And you start to see that they too are victims of the school system, because what has enabled them to become leaders is this loss of empathy. this
Mm.
survival strategy that you have to employ if you are going to get through those days, those weeks, those months in that school with virtually no family contact back then. You have to shut off your empathy in order either not to care about what's going on to other people so that you can mete it out and not be othered by the more powerful, aggressive, psychologically manipulative people. You either do that or you just shut it off for yourself so that you don't feel anything. And Johnson, Sunak, Cameron clearly had no feeling for others. They only had feelings
Mm.
for themselves and those around them with whom they could identify. Um, and I realized that was part of the cult, that the cult itself was kind of addressing the idea of the British Empire, that we were subscribed to a Union Jack waving idea of king and country and God save the Queen and Britannia ruling the waves and two World Cups, sorry, two World Wars and one World Cup. And this was why these people were not good leaders, because they aren't there to, they haven't been trained to lead an empire. They've been trained to lead an empire, but they haven't been trained to lead their own country. They've been trained to be able to go out into India and round up the masses and shoot them if they don't do what they want. You
Mm.
can't do that in your own country. That's not available. I mean, you can take steps towards that with aggressive laws and such like, and the drift to the right, as we've seen, because that disciplinarian attitude is very much at the heart of boarding school. But you can't round up a bunch of people rioting in Leicester and shoot them. Not yet, anyway. And that's why our leadership has been so inadequate, because this isn't what we were
Mm.
educated to do. We weren't educated to the world in which we live. We are
Mm.
we are ultimately, our inadequacies are not the ones that we imagine, that the shame that makes us drink or whatever. Those aren't our inadequacies. Our inadequacies are the result of the school that just taught us nothing about the real world, whether it be how to get a mortgage or whether it be how to conduct a relationship. It's taught me nothing of that at all. And even when I did
Mm.
try and engage with the real world later on in my life, like getting involved with campaigning about Clause 28 when I was at Radley College, that was I mean, people couldn't believe it. At one point, I think I
What's
was the
clause
only person
20?
who got the Guardian at the school, and for that I was bullied.
What's clause 28?
Clause 28 was the law in the mid to late 80s which banned the promotion of homosexuality in any manner. And I think from a very early age, I was drawn to any stories of injustice, and that to me felt just awful, like you were denying somebody's reality. Now I can see the reasons that I got caught up in stories like that, but they resonated with me. This idea that somebody who's gay isn't allowed to talk about being gay, that is just, it's insane to me. Like, come on, you might as well say
Mm.
cars don't exist.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is fascinating because in boarding schools, and forgive me if I'm not quite getting this right, but it wasn't frowned upon in a lot of these schools. So in my boarding school, there was a lot of gay men, single men who liked children. I mean, you would say, okay, they weren't gay, they were pedophiles. Yes, that's true, but they were essentially homosexual. And yeah, I almost feel that somewhere I've read, whether it's Hot House Society, uh, Gaythorne Hardy or something Gaythorne Hardy, I can't remember, but it was almost like it was accepted somehow in these schools, in certain boarding schools, like homosexuality.
Yeah, I can't really speak to that in so far as, I mean, certainly at Radley, it was it was a non-subject, like
Mm.
if anybody did engage in any kind of homosexuality at Radley, for instance, I never heard about it. What I heard about were merely insinuations and aggressive teasing and remarks like that. Um, I heard a few stories beyond that, but I mean, largely that didn't play into my public school experience. I mean, obviously, I don't think of any of the teachers who are abusing at Horris Hill as homosexuals. I think of them as paedophiles. I think these are different things. Um,
Mm.
they may have been homosexual, but that's not what the problem was. The problem was they were paedophiles. Yeah. My interest in Clause 28 was nothing to do with whether people were homosexual or not. It was just, it didn't seem fair to me. And I
Mm.
had it's another reason that I started having to dig into myself was not only were my reactions to the likes of Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson, not only were they, enough to make me sick, literally, but they were making me angry, man. They were making me so angry. And it had been like that when I now look back upon my life. It's been like that since I was a teenager. I just did not know to whom to apportion that blame. The moment I got to Radley, I forgot about everything that happened at Horris Hill because what happened to me at Radley was pretty damn terrifying too. It's the only
Mm.
time I ever thought I was going to die.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah, you've mentioned kind of lockdowns and how that kind of triggered something. I noticed that I was doing some research for the documentary the last couple of years, and I noticed that during lockdowns, were being advised by three people mainly: Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance, Boris Johnson. Obviously, other people in the background. Boris Johnson's an ex-boarder. Chris Whitty's an ex-boarder, third culture kid. So his family were in Africa. So I rarely saw them. And Patrick Vallance was at Truro School, which had boarding. I don't know if he boarded or not, but it's just interesting to see that. I think in one of Joyce Shavarian's talks at Boarding School Survivor Support in about 2001, she said that lockdowns are very much like boarding school, as you mentioned there. And I feel, if we look into the psychology of that, that as Peter Levine says, the man who was hit as a child will feel compelled to hit as an adult. That's trauma. In an insidious way, trauma contributes to the motives and drives of our behavior. So if we've suppressed it, as Jung says, the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. So I almost feel we were captive as children. We couldn't escape. And therefore, in our leaders, how much of that plays out into how they dealt with the lockdowns. That one rule for them, another rule for the others, for the rest.
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult to emerge from a world like I did, for instance, without having normalized it, without thinking that this is how society operates at large, especially if you haven't experienced much other life. And most of the people with whom I was educated, they lived a life that was, according to the principles of boarding school, like it was a life of privilege, whether they lived in Sydney Street in South Kensington or whether they lived in some vast, mansion in Hampshire. They didn't circulate a great deal in a world that didn't live with such privilege and didn't operate according to those rules, except perhaps when they went to buy their milk from Waitrose or whatever. And even that, I don't think was too gritty. Um, so I think that, it's inevitable when somebody like Boris Johnson is put in charge of the country in a time of crisis, he's going to adopt the rules of the leaders before him. And most likely those that have had greatest influence him are not Winston Churchill, for instance. It will be his headmasters. He'll return to that stereotype of all right, boys, you need to pull yourselves together now, act as one, and just fake it all. And as a result of that, I think lockdown was probably a more natural thing for him to do at the beginning, even though he didn't understand that himself. Once he'd had to put it on there, he was a bit like a child being taken back to boarding school. No, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. I don't want to go. You know what? God damn it. This is for the best. So yeah, I think there was quite a bit of that going on. I was driving around the UK in the weeks leading up to lockdown. I caught one of the very last flights to Berlin. And I was on tour with my girlfriend at the time, and it was insane, that period. The total confusion of what was happening and the denial that the country, especially those in charge of it, seemed to be in themselves. Again, it was almost cult-like. This can't
Mhm.
happen to us. There's no way the virus is going to cross the channel. Good God, don't they know who we are? It was amazing. It was a very good example, I think, of this kind of willing blindness in order to maintain, some form of recognizable familiar structure, which
Mm.
we've all seen play out if we've been to boarding school within our boarding schools.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, there were so many aspects of it that really struck home for me. One was can't see my parents anymore, and I think another really powerful piece of lockdowns for me was the argument nowadays that boarding schools have changed. Children have phones. And I'm like, okay, so my mother, she was living on her own. I could Zoom with her or, WhatsApp, but her mental health really struggled. And I know so many people's mental health struggled because they weren't in actual contact with others. Like you said, they weren't heard or they weren't seen. And it's like we need that. And that's kind of going back right to the basics of psychology. Children need to be seen, they need to be heard. And I really noticed that they say at school, these new schools, oh, they've got phones. Yeah, but it's not the same as actually being in the same space as your parents. So that was
Hmm.
something I really noticed in lockdowns. I was lucky I had, I was here with my wife. I mean, how was that for you
Well,
during
I was living alone,
lockdowns?
and initially, if I'm honest, I thought it was fabulous. Like, I'm surrounded by records and books, and I make my living out of writing about music, and it was almost like a dreamlike existence in a sense, in that I just did what I want. It wasn't that dissimilar to the existence I had anyway, because I work from home. I'm a freelance writer and translator, and so nothing really changed that much because I can already go days without seeing anybody if that's how my social life has panned out. I also kind of my initial response was, well, I'm prepared for this. I went to boarding school. I'm like that the guy who was taken hostage, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s, who returned after 5 years in captivity, and he was asked, so, how did you get through? He said, well, if you've been in the British Army and been sent to a British boarding school, turns out being a hostage isn't that hard. Um, so,
But
I
John
kind of, the
McCarthy.
first month or two, I really thought I was okay. And meanwhile, my girlfriend back in England was finding it very difficult. She had daughters, she lived alone, and it really wasn't doing her any good at all. And I was just like playing the strong, you know, boyfriend abroad, just, ushering her through these difficulties. But I did start to realize after a while that, it doesn't matter if I've been to boarding school or not. I'm not dealing with this well at all. I'm beginning to lose my mind. In fact, I don't think I even realized that until a little bit later. I think what was preempted it was this experience watching Dominic Cummings when he made me throw up. And that was where I realized, yeah, I'm not dealing with this terribly well, am I? This is this may be familiar, but it's not familiar in a way that is welcome at all. And the reason that it's taken me so long to recognize this is because I have employed all the lessons I learned at boarding school in order to prevent myself from feeling this, and it's now catching up with me. So yeah, it was a very confusing time for me. Very confusing
Mm.
time. And it, like many of the sort of most confusing times in my life, I've only understood them too late because I am so, or have been so out of touch with what my emotional response to something is. I know I'm responding to something, but I'm not terribly, not very quick to recognize whether it's excitement or fear, for instance. So yeah,
Mm.
funny enough, that was another thing I then started doing was I'd start watching documentaries. Once I'd realized that I didn't know how I felt about things, I started watching documentaries that I knew would provoke me emotionally. Um, Cheer, I remember, about cheerleaders in America was one. And I would watch this
Yeah.
and they would come up against some, terrible struggle. And then there'd be redemption or there'd be a sort of broken-hearted concession. So the idea that they'd never be able to change this. And I would start weeping uncontrollably. And in the past, I would have sort of like been slightly ashamed, hoped that no one could see me, even if I was alone. I'd be worried there might be a gap in the curtain and sort of discreetly wipe away the tears. But now what I do is I pause it. I would pause the show and allow myself to feel this like absolutely excruciatingly shuddering response, like a physical response to it, and then go, what am I feeling? What has this just provoked? Where is this coming from? And that proved to be a remarkably helpful way for me to get back in touch with my feelings as the pandemic progressed and to understand a lot better how to handle that situation without being triggered into a kind of re-traumatized senselessness.
Mm, fascinating. I love what you say about the documentaries. I often find that there's certain things I'll watch and I'll be in floods of tears. Sometimes it's joy, but sometimes it's just often I find if it's a film to do with father and son, my father was ex-border, he was at Abingdon, so
Okay.
close to Radley.
Yeah,
And, and therefore I didn't have a good relationship with him. He was an alcoholic, and yeah, he died when I was in my 20s.
I'm sorry.
And yeah, and that's okay. Thank you. And it was like when I watched those films, then that brings up some feeling within me. I mean, I'd love for us to segue a bit into music because I found that, boarding schools, one of the things I loved is the music, that we were all had our music and they were all, it's like, oh, you could borrow someone's CDs. Actually, there weren't CDs then, vinyl or tapes, and you could record things. And I remember that. And I really got into my music. And I found as I began my healing journey, re-listening to things that had been big, like the 1990s Stone Roses or The Beloved, I'd listen to them and I'd connect to my tears again. So I'd love for you to share a bit about your experience with music.
Well, yeah, I mean, I work as a critic a lot of the time, so music is a big part of my life, and that comes from not just the fact that my mother was passionate about music and I grew up with it around me, but also that it became a safe haven for me when I was a child. And the book that, when I had initially started shaping this book that I wanted to write about school, it was originally going to be called 10 Records That Stopped Me from Killing Myself at Boarding School. Um,
What a great
so
name.
I was gonna shape my experiences, or I was rather, gonna tell relate the experiences that I'd had at school through the prism of the music that reminded me of it. And I did start putting on records during the pandemic, sometimes when I was not entirely sober, it has to be said. And I would turn them up as loud as I dared and just immerse myself in them. And I'd have a scrap of paper to hand and a pen. And, getting a little bit drunk was part of the process because it removed some of my inhibitions. I would even dance on my own if the mood took me, whether it be the Smiths or whatever. But I would then scribble down anything that came back to me. And it soon became apparent that these records were more than just music. They were actually records of my life
Mm.
because I knew them inside out. I had bonded with these records for a reason, and it was normally more than just purely physical. Like, none of these records were dance records or anything like that. Most of them were sort of, even if they were louder records, they were certainly lyrical and introspective. And it began to occur to me that these records with which I'd bonded were, as I say, a record of my life because they contained codes, they contained keys to what I'd experienced. These records had successfully articulated things that I wasn't able to articulate, whether it be simple feelings or, in their lyrics, in their texts, actual emotions that I had experienced or arguments that I had experienced or such like. So I did start using music as a way of getting back into touch with my, childhood self. And um, yeah, I found so much that I had forgotten because I think probably, three of the things that have provided me with another world in which to exist have probably been alcohol, drugs, and music, and sleep. All of those provide me with a world in which I don't feel threatened anymore, or which I don't feel inadequate. Um, and it was rather glorious going back to this music and being able to connect to that child. I mean, there's not one single piece of film footage of me as a child, not one piece. There's photographs, not even that many photographs of me as a child, but this music, suddenly it's like, boom, I've just jumped right back in time. And the one that
Name
struck
a
me
couple
most
of
of all,
albums. Oh,
sorry,
please carry on. I was going to
well,
say,
I was going to,
I'd love you to
yeah, one of the
name
records
a couple of
that,
albums.
that one of the records that really moved me the most, oddly enough. Well, I'll give you two examples, which, might end up in this mythical book. One of the one of the records was a recording of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto. Now, I had spent much of the period between 8 and 12 being something of a, sanctimonious classical music lover at the expense of listening to pop music at all, partially because I didn't have a tape recorder and I only had a radio, and it wasn't very easy to listen to the radio at Horris Hill. There wasn't a great reception. But Radio 3 came through, very clear. The music that was broadcast into our dormitories at night was classical music. And the many of the teachers, including the two who molested me, were very much into classical music, very articulate on the subject as well. And I think probably a part of it was that I wanted to impress my parents. A part of it was that I wanted to feel safe with these abusers. And a third part was I really loved it. I've been getting back into classical music recently, and it's been absolutely, it's been a wonderful experience to start buying records again from Berlin flea markets, But this record that really, really got to me was Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto. I managed to locate the recording. I recognized the sleeve, so I got hold of a copy of the record and put it on and listened to it, and it blew my mind. I mean, I knew I loved that record. I've never stopped listening to it, but it just made me fascinated because I couldn't work out what it was that I loved so much about it. Like I knew that some of these other records really had secrets, but I didn't know what this one was. And it was only when I was on holiday in about 22, I think, in the south of Spain at the turn of the year with a friend, I chose for whatever reason to put Rachmaninoff on my headphones as I took a walk, like in the sunshine around lunchtime to go and, buy us all some more water from the village shop. And there was a bit of the music that suddenly, like, just I just gasped, like I started fighting for breath. And I realized that if you listen to Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, it's full of these incredible themes. I mean, it even gave birth to Eric Carmen's All by Myself. It soundtracks Brief Encounter. It is a defiantly sentimental work, full of these sweeping, majestic melodies and stuff. But throughout that record, throughout that concerto, every time you think you're about to meet that point where you get the happy ending and you punch the air and it's redemption and all the struggle's been worth it, he keeps on pulling the rug out from underneath you. And I realized that is how I had felt as a child at Horris Hill and then later at Radley, in that I worked so hard. I tried so hard to be what they wanted me to be, to do the things that they wanted me to do, and to care about the things that they cared. And every single time I thought I'd reached the point where surely they were going to say something nice, they pull the rug out at me again. Oh, you're not as good as you think you are, or you're too clever for your own good. Or don't get ahead of yourself. There'd always be some way of controlling me. And that was coded in the DNA of Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto. So that
Wow.
became vital as an illustration. And I'll give you one more if you like, if this isn't too
Please.
long.
Yeah, I
Model.
love music.
So the other one was a record that used to get piped into our dormitories on a Saturday night every few weeks. Saturday night was pop night. And we would get this beautiful instrumental electronic record. I knew it was a soundtrack. Uh, and this was piped in on a Saturday evening when we're reading, they used to call Tintin and Asterix trash. We could only read them on Saturday nights. Tintin, what taught me to read, ironically. And this record would come over, and I would just drift off into the world of this record. And there were certain bits of it where I literally, even today, I can picture what I saw then. It was like an image of my mother, kind of almost like Audrey Hepburn in an open top car, a scarf blowing behind her, then me sitting there as well with a picnic basket full of egg sandwiches and ginger beer or whatever. And she was taking me out for a picnic on the Sunday. And that was what I heard in this record. And the record, as far as I knew until I was about 11 or so, was called Benitez. And that was all I knew about it. But at one point, as a kind of, rite of passage, boys would sneak into the teacher's room where the stereo was when this record was playing and when he was on dormitory control, because actually this record was called Bilitis or Bilitis. It's by a guy called Francis Lai, who wrote A Man and a Woman. And it's the soundtrack to a soft porn lesbian schoolgirl film made in the 1970s by, I think, the man who made Emmanuel as well. So we were having a soft-score porn soundtrack about schoolgirls being piped into our dormitory. I was using this to be inspired about getting the hell away from the school with my dear old mum and dad. But no, if you looked at the picture of that record, there was a woman reclining on a tree, naked. Or there's two versions of it. Another one, I think there's two topless women sort of draped in silk, sort of, touching each other. I mean, that to me is insane. So what I got out of that was kind of the opposite in a way. But again, it sort of contains secrets. Like it highlights a kind of weird value system that says, you need to be perfect children, you need to behave, all for empire and such like. By the way, don't talk about how that guy just, tried to kiss you, and enjoy the porn soundtrack. I mean,
It's insane.
it's
How
bizarre.
on
It's
earth?
just so bizarre as an illustration of how morally confused these schools were. Maybe
Yeah,
still are. I
yeah.
don't know. I can't speak to them now. That's
Yeah,
another one.
I mean, have they changed? I know they have changed. I know they have counselors now, psychotherapists, but it's still 28 years after a child is abused before they come forward. So do we
We don't
know
know.
if they've really? We do not know because there are still no parents. And in the documentary, we interviewed Alex Renton. He says, we're a nation addicted to cover up. And does he think they're safe? These children? No.
My argument
Now,
is my argument is that for as long as these schools are so reticent about voluntarily acknowledging the abuse that took place within them, I don't see why we should trust them now. When I arrived
mm,
at school, it was like a school motto. It's different nowadays. You know, that wasn't true then, and it wasn't. I don't know if it's true now because they still haven't told us about what happened back then. You've got to win
mm,
our trust. If
mm.
for as long as those of us who have managed to deprogram from the cult, for as long as we are able to see that what we saw to them never happened, then of course, why should we think it's any different now? They say we have the highest, strictest safeguarding regimes, and you go, really? But why should I believe you? I mean, I'm not saying that
Mm,
any of these schools are actively trying to set it up so that people can abuse. That would be absurd. But I don't
mm,
understand why they can't put up their hands and go, you know what? We got it wrong now. That is why we are now able to ensure that this can never happen, because we have acknowledged what went wrong. You know,
Mm.
it's
Mm.
otherwise it's just a bit like giving a license back to an alcoholic so he can drive again.
Yeah, 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 you're right. You're right. Yeah, it is fascinating, you know, that they won't admit. And I know a lot of them say it's because of legal requirements. Or if they admit, then there would be an avalanche of people trying to sue them. But, you know, yeah, it's really, really, yeah, amazing. I mean, coming back to the music thing, what came to me is you were sharing there was I have listened through the music that I used to listen to at school. That's given me a lot of tears. But what I haven't done is listen to the music which was playing on everyone else's stereos
Oh, I
that
have.
I didn't necessarily like. And that's, oh, yeah. So that, there was certain music like Prince, The Clash, Dead Kennedys, Now Seven, they were on the stereo over and over again because it was a house stereo. And I'm like, it's interesting. It's almost like the somatic work of trauma is it's stored in our body. The trauma stored in our body, but it's almost like you're saying the music. It's almost coded in our body as well. And so I'm going to look and listen to some of those albums once I finish here. And it's like
Yeah, I
this
think
is
I think the ones that we identified with are the ones that we will find the secrets in about our innermost feelings and experiences. And we allied with those records as friends. We needed friends. We also used music, a lot of us, especially big music fans, we used it to define ourselves, to ally ourselves maybe with a worldview that was at odds with the one around us in a manner that, it was kind of disguised and coded. If you were a Smiths fan, whether or not you went to boarding school, you were more inclined to like somebody who liked the Smiths because you had identified yourself as a certain kind of person. And I think we used music in that way. Everybody uses music that way. That's definitely not exclusive to boarding schools, but it did certainly took on a very, very significant, my nickname, the latter part of my time at Radley was Indie Windy. You know, I embraced independent music,
Me
wholeheartedly,
too.
you know.
Me too. And the Smiths, interestingly, I shared a study on my sixth year with a friend, and he loved the Smiths, and I hated the Smiths. And it
But
was
again,
like,
like see that's fascinating because I think you will also find for different reasons, you will find secrets in the records that were your context. They weren't necessarily the ones that you embraced, but they will
mm,
bring back memories nonetheless. I mean, I can put on, for instance, the third Thompson Twins record, I think it is, Into the Gap, and
yeah,
it takes me to
mm,
a place where perhaps I can remember why I didn't like it at the time. Now, actually, I will champion that record to a large degree. But I've become a lot more open-minded. But there's especially the records to which you had a powerful reaction, a powerful negative reaction, they're still going to bring back contextual memories. Because if you've reacted it to that in that way, there's probably a reason that is more than just the melody. You know,
mm,
like we're not
mm,
built to waste our energy on music that just slightly bothers us. We waste it on something because it really, enervates us or something. So yeah, I
mm,
encourage anybody who has suffered trauma to go back to the music and the films. Perhaps, I used a few films as well, like A Bridge Too Far and Lawrence of Arabia to awaken feelings, films which I saw in the school chapel. But I encourage anyone to do that and to actually just pay attention to what they're feeling as the record plays. They don't even have to listen to the record so much as what it provokes in them. And maybe press
mm,
pause and just try and identify it. It might not be painful. It might be, but it will certainly be
mm.
helpful, I think.
That's a great idea. I've never listened back to the Smiths, and I interviewed him on my podcast a while ago, William Verling, and he's a medical doctor now. And we didn't talk about the Smiths, but I will go back to.
I mean, I'm not
Um,
saying that the Smiths are the be all and end all of this experience, and they've been somewhat soiled by Morrissey's more recent behavior. But, if I was going to pick out an indie record uh, that truly encapsulated my, anti-ruling class aesthetic, would actually be an almost unknown record by a band called Red Guitars, Tales of the Expected. And that kind of portrayed a world of ordinary working class people, and made it seem like a place where emotions were transparent and honest and communicated with genuine, depth and sentiment, and there was no reason for shame, and made, having to work in a car factory seem enormously more appealing than being surrounded by Victorian chapels and classrooms, knowing that you were probably going to go to Oxbridge for another 3 years after this if you weren't lucky. I say if you weren't lucky, because I think not going to Oxbridge was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Amazing. So we've got probably about 10 minutes until we get up to about an hour. Is there something that you would love for us to talk about that we haven't talked about yet? That's, whether it is about safeguarding or separating a child from its parents, mandatory reporting, duty of
I think
candor.
mandatory reporting is something we should look at. I mean, yeah, if you want to ask something about that, certainly I'd be willing to
Yeah,
express my
yeah. So,
support.
yeah, please, let's talk about mandatory reporting. What do you feel? I mean, at the moment, there is no mandatory reporting in any school or in
No.
the UK. What do you feel and what needs to happen?
Well, I think amongst the sort of mind-blowing moments of the last few years was when I learned that there's no law in place that means somebody is legally obliged to speak to authorities about child abuse. That struck me as a remarkable absence. Seemed to me common sense that somebody should be obligated to report that for fear of otherwise being penalized. And oddly enough, I've discussed this with people from all over the world, because Berlin is a very multicultural city, and whether they're from Norway or South America, they're shocked by this. Doesn't necessarily mean their countries have a rule in place, I might add, but nonetheless, they're shocked. So I did start looking into what these schools have to do, and there does seem to be an awful lot. It's an awful lot of use of the word "should" in school safeguarding. Teachers should do this or must do that, but there's no actual repercussions if they don't. So
Mhm.
mandatory reporting seems to me the most obvious solution to this problem, one which doesn't mean that schools have to be unnecessarily policed. I don't think we need to go to the other extreme. Mandatory reporting obviously is the obligation, the legal obligation for people to pass on information to authorities if they have witnessed or have suspicions of uh, abuse. And what I can't understand about this is, if there's no law in place, who stands to benefit? I That's a question, like, no one's ever given me a satisfactory answer. Um, if it includes them. Like, I've never heard a school sort of stand and go, well, it benefits us, of course, that's why we're against it. No one's going to do that. Yeah. But it doesn't benefit anybody except the schools. And it seems so strange to me that no government feels like children's safety. And this applies not just in boarding schools, this is across the board, this is in any institution. Like, why would a government not want to put that in place? That's a fundamental right as a child, is to feel that the people who should be protecting you are genuinely going to protect you. But then one remembers that when the EU ruled that corporal punishment shouldn't be needed to be introduced, the UK government took 2 years to put it onto its statute books, and then did not include private education. It took several years for that to be introduced across over a decade, I think, in some countries, in
I think, yeah, possibly 15 years.
something like that, 13 or 15 years, I think, for Northern Ireland finally to come on board. And when you see that, you start to see a pattern which is very, very worrying, which is, I don't think the British establishment really values children that much. So to me, mandatory reporting is a vital and shockingly overdue step that should never have even needed to be taken. I mean, that should have been one of the first things put into the rule book right from the start. If you see something bad being done to a child, the child is defenseless. So make sure that it is offered defense. It's just a basic. And I can't understand that the only reason this or rather this bill has been not put forward by successive governments. And now there is a bill. It has been given a reading in the House of Lords. We don't know when it's going to go further than that. But it was only put before the House of Lords because it was pulled in a lottery at the start of the new government. It wasn't even like, the government like, yeah, we need to get this started. It was, no, a baroness in the House of Lords. It was up to her to do it. We don't know if
Mm.
it stands any chance because the government still hasn't even said they're supporting it. So mandatory reporting is the only thing that I can look at upon which we all seem to, we seem to all share a certain degree of common ground, those of us who've been through this system and have not necessarily seen its best side. That is the first really concrete step that needs to be taken. And there is no genuine explanation to my mind that any institution can argue that it is a bad idea. Anybody who says it's a bad idea needs to take a really good look at themselves and ask themselves why it's a bad idea, because all it is about protecting children. There
Mm.
seems to be this
Mm.
very antagonistic side to the public school system that thinks that all victims are against them. I wasn't against Horris Hill per se when I started, pursuing the school. The school's, I should add, the school's former owners, not its current owners. I should have mentioned that earlier.
Right.
But I didn't want money. I just wanted them to say, this happened.
Mm.
And what I want the current owners of Horris Hill to do is to go, we are deeply sorry that this happened. And as such, we are going to support mandatory reporting. Because not only will that reassure their parents, the prospective parents, it will show victims that they have genuinely done something real, something that will affect the whole of the country for the good of its children. And I cannot understand why that wouldn't be seen as a good thing for everybody. Public schools need to be standing up right now and go, you know what, if the government won't do it, we're going to pressurize them.
Mm.
They should be putting
Mm.
up their hands. Then there's a reasonable chance people like me will go, what we experienced wasn't in vain. I
Mm.
didn't need money. They can have the little compensation they gave me. They can have it back if they start speaking out in favor of mandatory reporting. That is how important it is. I just want kids to know that there is another line of defense.
Yeah. 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 It's so true. I was speaking to Sarah Ockwell Smith about 6 months ago, who's written the book just about childhood in this country that we just don't seem to care about them. She was pointing out that if I was to hit you, I would get in trouble. I'd go to prison or I'd get in if we hit a child, oh, there's no problem with that. It's
Yeah.
it's like what? Well, why is that different? Oh, they need it. It's like she just points out that the logic behind it, and it's almost like, yeah, we don't care. We
No,
don't have that love.
any like, institution that thinks that, this kind of upbringing is the making of them, just
Hmm?
check the word make in the dictionary and then maybe ask yourself, did I mishear? Did they say breaking of them? Because I wasn't made, I was broken. By the
Yeah.
time I was 12, I couldn't leave a room without listening outside to hear what was being said about me because I couldn't trust those people. It didn't matter whether it would be my housemaster, my friends, or even my parents. I couldn't trust anybody. Even now, I struggle to trust.
Mm, mm. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Just there's so many aspects of it. boarding school, which for me doesn't work. I mean, we talk about attachment on this podcast quite a lot, that breaking of attachment. But it's like, yeah, there's so many aspects, and that we don't trust. It's same with me. I didn't trust people for years. I now do. I've learned to trust, but God, I try to keep everybody away from me. It's like you can't hurt me because those who got close as a child, wow, they really hurt me.
Yeah.
And it's like you're doing that again.
I mean,
But
I
what?
mentioned my cousin earlier and the fact that he had, gone off the rails. I mean, if you go to a school like ours, it's a little difficult to be able to separate right from wrong when the
Mm,
deputy headmaster himself is punishing you because you've behaved badly by doing something that is a great deal worse. I mean, I spoke to one former pupil who had not cheered loudly enough at the first 11 football match and consequently had to choose the golf club from the deputy headmaster's golf set, with which he was then beaten. Um, yeah, I mean, I've slightly forgotten, but that every time I tell that story, I kind of lose myself in it. I forgot what even spurred it, but yeah, what happened
your
there
cousin,
was, yeah, my
yeah.
my cousin didn't even make it to the end, by the way. My cousin died 10 days before the first settlement was offered. It was over a year since we had contacted the school.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and he, for years, had not spoken about anything that had ever happened to him. And I hadn't spoken to him about anything that had happened to us. And it broke my heart when he died because he was the first person to confirm my recollections. He was the first person to say, you know what, I'm going to stand up here as well. This is, affected me for life. And he was cheated again. He was cheated again by a heart attack. So he went to his grave never, ever knowing that they agreed, yes, this had happened. That's just, they'd had 40
Yeah.
years to do so. They'd had 40 years to do so.
Wow.
Yeah.
Hmm. I'm really sorry to hear about your cousin. Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. As we start to wrap up, is there anything else you would like to share, or anything else you'd like to talk about, Wyndham?
I think if there's one more thing I'd like to talk about, it would be to encourage a dialogue between these schools and their victims, um, so that the voices of both parties can understand one another better. As I said earlier, I think a lot of schools think that victims are out there to attack them, to gain revenge. And I don't think that's the truth. We just want acknowledgement. The schools think that if they acknowledge us, then they are open themselves up to reparations. But, that assumes that we want to go through that system, which is not a pleasant experience at all. So I think, if we can start to talk to one another more and acknowledge it, the schools need to fear less that there is going to be a monstrous backlash, and instead there will be a great deal of healing. Because if I've experienced one thing over the last 2 years, it is that while the victims have been intimidated even into their, middle age, they still feel intimidated by these schools. Um, these schools also need to stop trying to intimidate us. I think they see us as adversaries, they see us as threats, but we are their creation. And they need to start treating us as human beings rather than people trying to either pick at scabs or get a payoff. This isn't gold digging. There is no gold digging in these hills. What I was paid hasn't covered the therapy that I've taken the last 4 years. That's how little it was. It wasn't even as much as the fees that my parents spent to send me to that school in the first place. We need these schools to open up, to acknowledge it, and to speak to victims and understand themselves. We're not out for revenge. We just need to be acknowledged. And for as long as people like myself speak out, I hope, that force will grow until it becomes inevitable, because I think this is a national scandal. Like, I really do think we are looking at abuse on a vast scale,
Yes.
absolutely vast scale. And for as long as the public schools run and hide away from this truth, we can't be sure they're safe. We can't be sure that the establishment is being filled with, as it will continue to be filled. We can't be sure that it's being filled with mentally healthy people. So start
Mhm.
talking to us. Start putting your hands up. Start proving that you're as good as you think you are. Start living by the code that you imposed upon us. And if you
Mhm.
don't, we're going to treat you like you treated us, which was, instead of, for instance, one child standing up, putting up its hands, the teachers would just go, right, if no one's going to put their hand up, you're all going to do, uh, punishments. Because until the school's going to start up, we're going to generalize. We're going to generalize because we know it took place in huge numbers of these schools. So frankly, the entire system doesn't bear supporting unless they will acknowledge it. Show us just how
Mhm.
few schools it is in that case. Be proud of your histories, and then make us proud to having come from a school which decided to do something for the better at last. Tradition
Mhm.
doesn't work anymore in this 21st century.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Powerful words. Thank you, Wyndham, for all you've done and, the campaigning and with Horris Hill and for your words today. It's like very touching. So, yeah, if people want to get in touch or find out more, where's the best way to buy your books?
Well,
To
get my book on from all great booksellers, and I'd heartily encourage you to use an independent one if you can, rather than the great big
Yes.
bookseller in the sky. Um, for whose support I'm obviously very grateful. Um, you can find my music writing in Uncut and Classic Pop and The Quietus and various other places, or you can contact me, especially particularly if you're a victim of Horris Hill who hasn't spoken out. I would heartily encourage you to get in contact with me. I do have a website, wyndhamwallace.com. It hasn't been updated for several years, but the email address does work. Um, and yeah, if anybody needs to talk to another survivor at any time, I can be one of those people. Um,
Mm,
I know that being able to share with people is the fastest route to, at least, if not healing, at least opening up yourself to healing. And
mm, so
yeah, that's
true.
why I miss my cousin.
Mm, thank you. Thank you. Bless you, Wyndham. And yeah, I look forward to speaking soon. And people who are listening, please do go and have a look at Wyndham's books. So yeah, thank you so much. Okay, take care.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks, Piers. Bye bye.